Well, I don't pretend to know in any detail how an intelligence guided evolution would work, but it would address the objections that I've listed already. The intrinsic disposition would, if there was some kind of intrinsic disposition placed there, it would drive development of irreducibly complex organs, creatures becoming more perfect in successive generations, and so on. It would also provide a nice synthesis of the evidence from modern science for some kind of evolution. Now, those are all just speculations, but let's keep that in mind for a second. How then do we deal with Genesis? Doesn't it clearly teach that God created the world in 1 week? Well, there are a couple of reasons we should not be too attached to that interpretation. First, we must remember that Genesis is not meant to be a scientific account of the origin of the cosmos. And if anybody wants to plant their flag on that hypothesis, I just think it's completely unreasonable. Genesis starts with one creation story in chapter 1, and then in chapter 2 it starts telling another creation story. So if the gentleman who wrote it is trying to give a scientific account, he's very redundant. I think it's more reasonable to assume the story in Genesis is a poetic account that's intended to tell us something about the relationship between God and creation, as well as its purpose. And this is not some kind of abstract concept. We do this sort of thing all the time. It would be something like if I asked you, where's your home? And you could respond with a very cut and dry answer. You could give me the address, you could give me the coordinates, you could tell me where it's located relative to some landmarks or something like that. Or and you'd be speaking the truth in all those cases. Or you could say something like, well, home is where my family is, or home is where the heart is, or something like that. And those statements would be no less true, but they get at a different aspect of the essence of your home. Namely, its relation to the emotional or spiritual aspects of the person, or something like that. Now, I think if you study Genesis carefully, there are good reasons to interpret it in this way. Now, to really flesh out this theme would be another lecture all by itself, but lucky for you guys, I happen to know somebody who teaches at this school who would do a really good job. I'm going to talk to him about it and see if we can get something like that going next time. But for now, I'll just quickly try to highlight one example of it, just one example of this sort of thing. So consider Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 2. The earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the waters. Two important things that the inspired author tells us. The cosmos is there, but it's formless and it's empty. No structure, nothing filling it. On the first day, God speaks creation into being, first creating the light and the darkness, day and night, which is reminiscent of time. On the second day, verse 6, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, let it separate the waters from the waters. And he calls it the sky. Now we have two places, the sky and the sea, which is reminiscent of space. What is more fundamental than that? God has created space and time, the dimensions in which all material things reside. And then on the third day, God makes the land, and it brings forth vegetation, plants yielding seed and fruit trees, which is a sign of life, vitality, and abundance. At the end of those first 3 days, God has solved the problem of formlessness. It's like God has built a house and furnished it, but it's still empty. We still have the problem of the void. The cosmos has structure, but there is nothing filling it. So on day 4, 5, and 6, God creates the sun and moon and the stars to fill the day and the night, birds and fish to fill the sky and the sea, and finally beasts and men to fill the lush earth. Now the problem of emptiness is resolved. The days fit together perfectly as two sets of three, the second set to fill the first. On the seventh day, he rests. Now, in Hebrew, the word, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I'm told that the word for swearing a covenant is the same word as the number 7. So someone who said, I swear a covenant in Hebrew, was literally saying, I seven myself. So in other words, God has called the world forth from nothing. He's given the world a structure. He's filled the structure, and he has a covenantal relationship with the world. The first revelation that God doesn't rule his creation like a tyrant rules his slaves. Rather, he loves his creation. So examples like this seem to me to indicate that the choice of words and the imagery in Genesis is not just a narrative of chronological events that get at the progression of material causes or processes, though that account would be incredibly interesting in its own right. But that doesn't seem to be the point of Genesis. Rather, I think it's a poetic device and a beautiful image to show the order among the works of creation and their relationship to God. So, the language, yes, I would say the language of Genesis does not seem to necessitate a literal 7 24-hour days. And this is further evidenced by the fact that some, not all, but some, of the church fathers also interpreted the 6 days figuratively. For example, Origen, St. Justin Martyr, St. Cyprian, and St. Irenaeus all speak of the days of creation as being periods of time, maybe on the order of 1,000 years. St. Augustine, one of the church's greatest theologians, thought that the light on the first day of creation, when God creates the light, that was actually an image of God creating the angels, and separate the light from the darkness was the bad angels falling. And that was what was meant by that first day. An interesting interpretation. And that seems reasonable when reading Genesis 1 carefully. It begins by saying that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Not that God created everything without any intermediate causes. The author of Genesis continues, and God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation. Let the land put forth living creatures according to their kinds," as if to suggest that the living things may have come forth in the earth's own manner. This could have been the result of inclinations intrinsic to the matter of nature, but they would be inclinations that must still ultimately come from God. To put it in very general terms, God may have endowed amino acids with a tendency to form proteins, and proteins with a tendency to form molecules that are necessary for life, and all the rest of it. In this case, he would have created some things immediately, but other things he would have left to develop through intermediate causes, letting the earth put forth life in its own mysterious and wonderful way. The idea of matter being self-organizing does not seem incompatible with a reasonable interpretation of Genesis. And finally, there doesn't seem to be any theological reason why God could not have used creatures as intermediate causes in the creation of the world. In fact, this seems to be in keeping with the way God's providence typically comes about, through imperfect instruments like ourselves. This is because it pleases God to bestow the dignity of being real causes on his creatures. It makes them more like him, who is the supreme and uncaused cause. So, for example, God spoke to Abraham and Moses through an angel. He saved Jacob and his sons through Joseph during the famine in Egypt. He saved our Lord from the slaughter of the holy innocents through another Joseph, telling him in a dream that he needs to flee to Egypt to get away from Herod. Even today, he does not save the poor and the oppressed immediately, but invites us to step forward and with his grace, perform spiritual and corporal works of mercy. So could something like this not be the case with animals, plants, and matter? It seems possible, and nor should that possibility scare us. Great theologians like Augustine and St. Thomas thought that the matter of the earth was capable of bringing forth living things spontaneously. You've probably heard of spontaneous generation, or abiogenesis, the fancier word. Again, to them, this was just another way that God was bestowing the dignity of being causes on his creation, each reflecting his perfect causal power in some way. Spontaneous generation may sound laughable to us, although nobody's laughing. But what we ought to appreciate is that the great doctors of the church had no fear of the idea that creatures could develop from non-living matter naturally, because it would still be within the providence of God. And so it seems that the words of Genesis do not exclude evolution as a means God could have used to bring forth the different creatures on earth. I argue even hints at some sort of development of species. And again, St. Thomas seems open to the possibility. Father John Koo, a professor of theology at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., summarizes the teaching of St. Thomas in this way. At times, quoting Augustine explicitly, Aquinas speaks of seminal essences or principles given in creation that blossom into full form later. Obviously, he's not thinking of Darwinian evolution, but his thought is not incompatible with what modern science appears to confirm. Now, it's true, these are just theological reasons for accepting some kind of evolution. These speculations are not based on they're based on revelation, not on any scientific evidence that I've got access to. But truth harmonizes with truth. And so I think we should be perfectly open to the possibility of some intelligence-guided evolution. Now, at this point, someone might object, but if matter is self-organizing, doesn't that mean that matter is the ultimate explanation for biodiversity on our planet? There's no real purpose placed in things by God, and that we don't even need God in this explanation? Quite the opposite. This hypothesis of some kind of intelligence-guided evolution would require an intelligent creator even more. Consider this example. So it's Christmas time, and your dad brings home 2 toys. They're both in their separate boxes. And the first box has got a robot and a bunch of parts. And he dumps it out on the floor, and the robot starts to assemble the parts into other robots like himself, like the robot itself. And what would you think of that toy maker? Well, you'd probably think, wow, that's a really intelligent toy maker. But it'd be kind of weird. But the second box has just a bunch of parts. And your dad dumps them on the floor, and as you look at it, you notice the parts start to assemble themselves into other robots, and then those robots start making other robots like themselves. Now, so which one would you think was made by the more intelligent toy maker? The second one, yes, the second one. Yeah, the self-organizing feature of this amazing toy that I'm still looking for does not exclude any need for a toy maker. Similarly, none of these things like matter self-organizing, amino acids forming proteins, or living things developing into different living things eliminate the intelligent designer from the picture. If we were to discover that matter is self-organizing, and we could understand the mechanisms by which this happens, it would not be an argument against God's existence. It would only be greater evidence for some intelligent designer. Now, this is a really big if. Maybe evolution will one day be verified. Maybe it will turn out to be false. But the main point I want to leave with you is that there is no reason for us Christians to fear the evidence of species developing and changing put forward by modern science as if it were a threat to the existence of God. Like John Paul II said, do not be afraid. There's nothing to be afraid of there. I will say this though, because materialist evolution now, not evolution simply speaking, but materialist evolution in a qualified sense, it disregards purpose in its encounter with the natural world. And so, and consequently, any sort of divine orderer or God, we must as Christians reject materialist evolution. That is true. And I would add that there are serious philosophical difficulties with materialistic concept of evolution. And I think they're insurmountable without some notion of purpose in things. But we should be careful of drawing conclusions about science from Genesis. Because in doing so, as St. Augustine warns, we risk damaging the credibility of the Scriptures. Happily, however, the Scriptures, I hope I've convinced you that the Scriptures and the traditions of the Church do not require us to dismiss the possibility of some kind of intelligence-guided evolution. We should be open to and rejoice in the discoveries of science. There certainly seems to be plenty of scientific evidence in favor of some kind of development of the species. And in fact, that even if it turns out to be true, it does not at all exclude God from a true view of reality. In fact, I think an intelligence-guided evolution, in some ways, sounds much more godlike than a literal 7 days of creation. That from a few simple material principles, infused with the natural inclination to order themselves by the true God, creation slowly blossoms into the beautiful world we see today, bringing forth life in its own mysterious way. I think that's an incredible thing to imagine and contemplate. But of course, Darwin says it much better than I can. He said, "There's a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." I would only add that this grandeur springs not from purposeless causes, but from the natures and intrinsic principles God has placed in creation, and it's beautiful to behold. Else there's no account for why some animals become more perfect, or irreducibly complex organs, or why we can trust our senses and all the rest of it. If we are living things forced out of chance mutations by necessary laws of natural selection and survival of the fittest, then we've destroyed science. So let us follow the evidence wherever it leads and have no fear of traveling down a foreboding road that will lead us to a precipice of unbelief or loss of our knowledge. We'll never exhaust the beauty and mystery of the order that God has laid out in creation, and we should never stop striving to understand it, because all of nature is something of the mind of God, and the better we understand it, the better we understand Him, and the more we can love Him, and that's the most important.